Hello. Okay. I'm host and AV tonight. Hi everyone. I'm Terrence. I'm the manager of 192 Books, and we are here to celebrate the launch of José Donoso's A Mysterious Disappearance of the Marquise of Loria, published by New Directions and translated by Macdowell. I just got stressed. I pronounced every word in that sentence wrong. I had to look at the book cover. But José Donoso, 1924 to 1996, wrote novels, novellas, short stories, and poetry. He worked stints as a shepherd in Patagonia and a stevedore in Buenos Aires before studying at Princeton and teaching at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. He was twice a Guggenheim Fellow and won the William Faulkner Foundation Prize, as well as Chile's highest literary honor, the National Literature Prize. Megan Macdowell lives in Santiago, Chile. She has translated many of the most important contemporary Spanish language authors, including Alejandra Zambas, Samantha Schweblin, Mariana Enriquez, and Lena Marijuan. She's been nominated 4 times for the International Booker Prize and was a recipient of a 2020 award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She won the 2022 National Book Award in Translation alongside Samantha Schweblin for 7 Empty Houses. Megan will be speaking with Zito Madu, who is a Nigerian-American writer living in Brooklyn. He's the author of the surrealist memoir, The Minotaur at Kayalanza. This event's being live streamed and archived on our YouTube, 192 Books, and at the Paula Cooper Gallery Studio website, along with 1 or 2 of Megan's other translations. And the books are available here for sale, and we're going to do a talk and then a Q&A, and then you can come up and buy the book and chat with them. Thank you.
You want to go first?
Well, I just want to say thank you guys for coming, because this was kind of put together at the last minute, and I really appreciate it. I was mentioning to a couple of people here that the first ever book event that I did was here, and no one came. So it was with Alejandro Zambra for the first book I ever translated by him. And so it's very nice to see that all the seats are filled. And I'm really grateful to have Zito here to talk about the book. We've talked about it a little bit one-on-one, so now let's talk about it with you guys.
All right, perfect. I think we should start off with you reading a very particular chapter or passage of the book.
This is just it's
you
just a
see, she
paragraph.
has her remarkable with her in her notes.
So this is a quote or a paragraph that I find crucial for understanding the book, I guess. So it goes like this. Let me set it up a little bit. So the the main character Blanca is remembering a moment in her youth when she lived she's from Nicaragua, and she was always kind of threatened or promised a trip to the ocean. And so she built the idea of the ocean up in her head. And when she finally did go and see it, she felt that she was a little disappointed by it. So this is what she says. A thing that existed only in the world of people who knew nothing of it. That was no more than the formation of a legend, a fantasy. That thing was missing for Blanca in her first sighting of the sea. A thing that was something more than the something that it certainly was. Last night with Almanza was like the delight of sinking down into the warm swells of the Caribbean, like swimming without risk in that pure aquamarine, like feeling all the salt and the sun of childhood designating the shape of her body, like letting herself go, be rocked, lulled, all quite essential, quite wonderful. But she was lacking the same thing that she had missed in that first view of the sea, when she was such a little girl that she allowed herself to feel truths and say them aloud. It was decidedly not the devastating adventure projected by the magnificent ambiguity of the word, especially the word refracted in the imagination of those who, one way or another, are unable to take part in it. So that's just a little piece of it that I think we'll come back to in the course of the conversation.
Okay, so I think we were talking about this earlier, but there's something fascinating about that view of the ocean and her disappointment in it. And also I think when you put it with the sort of dalliance that she has with Almanza, that it starts off very intense, or like the fantasy of it starts very intense, and then it becomes disappointing towards the end. And I think when we were talking about what that view of the ocean meant as the structure of the book, you said that it also represents what the book is, which is like a search for identity. And so I'm wondering, like, when you say, you know, when you look at that passage and you realize that she's disappointed by it, do you also see that reflected in the whole of the book?
So yes, I do. I think that, so to put this a little in context, this is a book that is set up like an erotic novel. It's told in episodic moments that are oftentimes erotic encounters. And it's also set up in terms of a detective story. So we go into it with these certain expectations, where the narrator is kind of he's almost documentary. In the first chapter, he gives you facts, where he sets up this character who is Blanca Loria, who is a Nicaraguan woman who's married into the aristocracy in Spain. And as we go through the novel, that the voice or the tone of the erotic novel or the detective novel kind of becomes fractured and starts to come into question. And there's a similarity or a parallel between this search for erotic fulfillment and a search for knowledge. And to me, that search for erotic fulfillment is like her search for the sea when she was a child, because she thinks of it as something that is going to be totalizing and all-encompassing, and that it's going to change her life. And it's the same thing that she has with sex, where she is searching for this sexual satisfaction that doesn't come and doesn't come and doesn't come. And then we get to the end where she has to deal with this idea that it's not gonna come. Jeez. But she does many times.
Yes, yes. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the sort of, you know, that idea from going to Latin America to, like, you know, Spain, and how that's represented in the book, and that sort of, I guess, the identity crisis that comes with it. But you like when we were talking earlier, you brought up a certain word that is actually representative of this sort of clash of regions and this sort of clash of cultures.
Okay, you're going right to the difficult questions.
We might as well.
Okay, so I think that before we talk about that, we should maybe give. So there's going to be a little bit of talk about sex in this yes. talk. So spoiler,
we're just setting up the stage.
And there's also going to be maybe some spoilers, but hopefully the spoilers, I don't think they're going to take away from the enjoyment of reading the book. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that I had to deal with a little bit in the translation of this novel is the importance of a writer, Rubén Darío, mm-hmm. who is very important in Latin America and almost unknown in English. And there's one or two chapters where his poetry is talked about, recited, kind of parallels the actual text, the plot of the novel. And I was I had to kind of deal with the fact that there isn't a satisfactory translation of Dario in English. And one of the word that for me sums this up is the word cursi. Out of curiosity, how many Chileans are here right now? There's one. Latin Americans, okay, a couple of Latin Americans. Spanish speakers. Okay, so the word cursi is something that I have thought a lot about in the course of this novel. And it's something that, I feel like every time I translate a book, I find myself interrogating certain words. And cursi was one of those words for this novel. Because in other instances, I've translated it as cheesy, tacky, kitschy. In this novel, I ended up going with sentimental. And none of that, I think, really conveys the whole history of the word cursi, which I found out in kind of looking into this novel, because it came into use in Spain at the turn of the 19th or 20th century, and it means a person who is from the lower middle class who's trying to mimic the upper class through aesthetics. And it came to mean in Spain, it was obviously derogatory at first, and there was this need to differentiate between true elegance and the cursi, like the imitation. And then in Latin America, it was, Dario is the writer who took that idea of cursi and turned it into something else, which is the assertion of an identity using the tools of this kind of poetic aristocracy, let's say. And so, in Latin America, there's a before and after Dario. And before Dario, almost never did you find people talking about poetry as too cursi. But after Dario, it was something that was much more in the conversation. So it's interesting to me that he's so key in this book. And I think that it's something that I thought about a lot in the translation and worried about a lot, because I don't know that whole context of Dario and what he means in Spanish is going to be understood in English. And I also was really scared about translating Dario because he is quoted in the text. And so I didn't translate it. I got someone else to do it, who is a great translator named Forrest Gander. And so he took the kind of the translations that existed, and he translated these poems. So the specific instances of those poems are his translation.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Also, like when we're talking about this sort of concept of, I guess, like true elegance versus the aesthetic putting-ons of elegance, I think that goes back to the conversation that we were having about the narrator himself. I think when you first sent me the book, one of the things that I sent was a screenshot. And I was saying that it's always funny to me that in very high-minded literature, the word for penis is always written as like member or but it's this way of like saying it in a way that's not direct, that's not sort of like, I guess, callous.
Yeah.
So, but like you see that in the language itself is written very high-minded, and is written, is written in a way that fits the people, the sort of status of the people that it's talking about. But then, of course, things start going awry very quickly. But you also said that like the narrator is not completely trustworthy.
Right. Yeah. So the language, there's kind of like the language changes throughout.
Yes.
And I think it's important to mention that because, I talked about how there's this influence of erotic literature, this influence of detective literature, and this influence of modernismo with Dario, which is very given to flowery language and adjectives, like lots of adjectives. So there is kind of an elevated language that comes with modernismo, and it's definitely an influence on the book. And to me, the narrator, and it took me a minute to realize this, is not a reliable narrator.
Okay.
And because, it starts out in this kind of documentary style, giving you facts. But everything that's set up in the first chapter comes to be questioned and complicated and turned around largely through the desire of the various characters. And so nothing that that you're set up to think in the first chapter turns out to be true. And so the whole book has this kind of struggle between order and chaos. And I think that this is an interesting question, like what you thought when you first read this book. When I first started reading it, I was a little disappointed because I worked first on this book, The Obscene Bird of Night, which many of you may have read. And it's very dark and complex and labyrinthine. And I came to read this book, and at first I fell into something that I think a lot of critics have fallen into, which is to think that it's trivial or superficial. Because it felt so male-gazy. You know, it starts out talking about Blanca and, oh, she's so beautiful and everyone wants to have sex with her. And I was like, I don't get into those depictions of male-gazy beauty. But it's not that. It starts out with that, and then it complicates it in many situations. In the sense that a lot of the things that he tells you, are then told in a different way. And I feel like a lot of the book is this struggle between the order imposing narrator, which is, you know, a male narrator. The implied narrator is a male narrator. He's writing these popular, comforting genres. And then there's this struggle that Blanca has for her identity. And she's the female. She's chaos in a way. And she's kind of fighting back against this more genre documentary style.
Yeah, so I think when we want to talk about that sort of conflict between order and chaos, I think it's interesting because I want to talk about her husband and the role that he plays in this. Because I think if you look at her as, you know, the chaotic element in here, one of the first things not one of the first things, but I think a very important erotic moment is when they're at a play. And I don't want to spoil anything, but like they're at a play and he is touching her while the play is going on, and her mother's right there, or his mother's right there, like her sort of, what would you call Amanza? Like
the mother-in-law's lover.
Yes, lover / like life partner, etc., or whatever he plays.
So the mother is also a widow.
Yeah.
And now she has this lover.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the two newlyweds are, sort of having a moment. The mother doesn't notice this, but Almanza notices as well, right? Like he has this and I think he plays this role several times where he knows what's going on, and he's taking pleasure in knowing what's going on, even if nobody else does. But I want to think about like that sort of conflict of order and chaos, because that sight of being in this very refined, elevated play, and everybody else is behaving in a way that people of high society should behave, but she and her husband are not. They're having a whole different experience.
He's not yet her husband.
Oh, sorry. Before they're married, but it's like this sort of thing where, they're infusing this chaotic element, but they're the only two, or they and Almanza are the only people who are aware of it. And I think that chaos starts a little bit from there. It starts like growing, and ends up doing what it does in the novel. But what did you think of the scene where there's watching this play and he's like explaining things to her, or explaining what's going on, but it's actually an act because there's something deeper going on there?
Right. So the relationship between her and Paquito, Paquito is this Spanish aristocrat who she eventually marries. And before they get married, she basically realizes that she's into him when she's at a dance, and she realizes that he is very well endowed. And she says, "I want that." And so then they have this courtship, and they get married. And in their courtship, they have these kind of erotic encounters, but they never actually have sex. And one of them is in this performance of Lonergan, right?
Yeah.
And so they're watching, and they're having this kind of like under this surreptitious erotic encounter, which comes to define their encounters, because it turns out that Paquito, although he's very well endowed, can't perform. So once they're married, she stays with this like desire to be satisfied that can never be satisfied. But that moment, we come back to that moment through the book, because, there are several things, but we were talking about how the mother watches Blanca in this kind of rapture as she's taking in the play, and her rapture is actually sexual, but Casilda, the mother-in-law, thinks that she's in this rapture from watching the play, and she says to herself, "Oh, I guess I'm just old. I can't appreciate art the way I used to, and oh, these primitive South Americans, I guess they can. There is something beautiful about their ability to appreciate art."
Yeah, and I think we were talking about how the way that the mother looks at her at the beginning is very backhanded, right? Like, she thinks little of this girl, and she thinks little of like the people that she's from. But she, like, I remember reading it, and she like very directly compares her to a monkey.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's this idea of like you're closer to nature and you're able to appreciate this high-minded thing, even if you don't understand it. It like touches you deeply in the soul. And it comes off like you would think that she's like complimenting this woman, but she's actually just saying that you're like so beneath the rest of us that it touches your soul directly. Yeah. But it goes back to what we were saying, like the question that I asked at first of like this sort of conflict of the clash of regions, this conflict of class. And even though she dresses up in the same way, that she could perform the same way that they do, like certain members in that world do not see her as being part of their group. And I think that shows up over and over. And it comes into like the way that they try to, I guess, take control of her life. And so the book sort of becomes this, like we said, it becomes this like sexual exploration and like identity exploration. But you have, I think what was fascinating to me is that you have all these people trying to grab at her in different ways, right? Like Almanza is like very destructive. Like at first it's satisfying, then he's like very destructive. And then she finds out that he actually just wants.
I don't see Almanza as destructive.
I think that scene that there's a very particular scene when they're in I think, what was it, the couch? The first time that they have sex. And I don't know. I think so much of the book is also like kinky, but also like he was kind of berating her as right before they have sex.
I think that the different episodes of the book, which are different erotic episodes, explore different kind of fetishes.
Yeah.
And it can make you uncomfortable as a reader, There's one where she has sex with an old man, which is not a comfortable thing to witness.
We were gonna get to that.
There's one with Almanza, which is almost kind of a rape fantasy.
Yeah.
There's some cross-dressing, there's some lesbianism. She kind of plays with all these different fetishes. But to me,
I love that you ignored the thing that she does with the artist when they're.
Okay, no, the artist is very important. Okay, right, because if you think about, so spoilers abound here, but there's the artist who represents the possibility of true romantic love, which we come to see as also just another fetish. And it's not satisfactory for her. And all of these things are like, I always come with José Donoso, I always come back to the word masks. All of these fetishes, all of these, things that she's trying are these kind of masks or tools that she's trying on and then rejecting. Because she's trying to reach this kind of fulfillment of her identity. And she's looking for it through this kind of sexual satisfaction, and she's not finding it. And to me, the artist is really interesting because you see, me as a reader, like I have internalized so many of the narrative tropes. The first time I read this book, I did not understand why she couldn't go for Almanza. I mean the Archibaldo, the artist, because that seemed to be something that was a true emotional love and a true physical love, and it's like, what's wrong with that?
Mm-hmm.
And when she rejects him, there was a part of me that said, why?
Yeah.
And then I had to think. Once I thought about it, I realized that that's another iteration of this. She's looking for her identity through being looked at, through being seen, in a lot of the book, she defines herself by how people see her, and she defines herself by being this kind of sexual being and by being this person who other people want. But then a lot of her most satisfying encounters come when she's by herself. And when she's kind of channeling this subconscious in the form of a dog. I don't know if I
want to actually, we are eventually going to get to the dog, but I think now that we brought up the artist, because the dog belongs to him. And the first time that she encounters a dog is that when they encounter each other, and the dog is like yapping at her leg and like sort of is very aggressive towards her, and then comes to find her at home. But like what you're saying is like the way that she's perceived, and she sees herself as someone who is seen by others. I think it was very fascinating with the artist, and I think when I read it, I understood why she didn't go with him, because the thing that she kept saying before things got very wild is that he wouldn't ask about why the dog was there. Like he had no concern about the dog, which is, so the dog finds her at home, and she like takes the dog into her room, and it belongs to him. But the whole time like they meet, he doesn't say anything about the dog. Like it is supposed to be like his dear dog, and it's missing, and she has him, but he doesn't actually ask about the dog, or like there's no concern about it. And it becomes this thing that she keeps repeating. It's like, it's the thing that is left unsaid, the questions that he won't ask. Like, it's almost as if it becomes this like signal that he doesn't really want to know much more about her, right? Like, the dog is there and it's causing this chaos, and he has no concern about it. He just wants her the same way that like everybody else wants her. And I think that leads into like why her satisfaction comes only when she's like whatever the dog represents. And I think we could talk about that later.
Well, yeah, and also he's a painter. He's a portraitist, which means that he paints these pictures of people, supposedly realistic pictures. But we also come to realize that he distorts the truth. So he paints Tere, who is a character we haven't mentioned yet, but he paints her, who's this upper class Andalusian, as a lower class Gallega. And, and Blanca goes to him wearing a tennis outfit, being like, I want to pose as a tennis player. She's not a tennis player. Yeah. So he also represents this kind of male gaze and this person who is the representation of reality, but he also distorts the reality. And I think it's important to pay attention to those moments in the story where reality is told in two different ways, or in multiple ways, or we see people distorting reality. Because then you start to realize that this narrative is not reliable. Yeah.
I also think he's interesting because I think, like, when you're talking about distorting reality, about the way that he's kind of false, I think one of the comments that they make about him is that he's just mimicking his master. That so much of what he paints is just an imitation of someone that's better.
That is key.
Right? Like,
that is very key.
All of his paintings aren't really his, essentially. Right.
Yeah. And when she first meets him, she becomes kind of obsessed with his eyes. Yeah. These lemon gray eyes. Yeah. And then the next time she sees him, she realizes that his eyes are just black. But it's the dog who has the lemon gray eyes. And then she becomes obsessed with the dog's eyes of his dog. Yeah.
But also I think like the first time that she meets him, he's much more erotic and much more interesting to her. Because it's like, it's the thing where he notices that she's having a sexual moment, and they're out in public, And he knows this, and it's almost that knowledge, that shared knowledge that they have, that she finds him also more mysterious than once she starts to get to know him, and she knows that like it was just on an act, and he wants this. I guess he wants this very structured life with her.
Right.
Right. Like it just becomes.
Yeah.
She's kind of disappointed.
So what we're talking about here might be just a stream of spoilers, but they're also
we
just
have spoiled the entire
you guys. Like these are things that we are thinking about as we've been reading the book, and I could be wrong about a lot of this stuff, but it seems to me that in the first chapter and in the last chapter, there's this idea of imposition of this order, this binary order that Blanca, the main character throughout the book, has been resisting. And when her disappearance, which is no spoiler because it's in the title, is her rejection of all of these impositions of order. She turns away from it. And in a way, she escapes this authorial voice that's trying to tell her story in a certain way. And a lot of the book is her kind of catching glimpses of this this chaos, subconscious, feminine, Latin American side, and kind of, this is really open to interpretation, but I would say maybe choosing that or choosing neither of them.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, this book sets up a lot of binaries and then tries to show you that the binary is false.
Yeah, and so I think that's an interesting way of seeing that, because what was on my mind when I was reading the book, and even now, is like her disappointments, right? Like I think we've talked about this, is like she's disappointed in almost everyone that she ends up encountering, even, you know, her husband at the beginning. Here she is, she chooses him because of the idea of sexual satisfaction that she's gonna have. All to find out that that's not true, right?
Yeah.
Or that he needs very particular conditions for him to be able to have sex. But her relationship with Almanza, that's also becomes disappointing. She's consistently disappointed by all these people. And I think at first she sees them as like these powerful figures for whatever reason. And then eventually you like see the sort of the build up to that disappointment, and even towards the end with the driver, like we talked about earlier, she's even disappointed in him at the end. And she might be enjoying it, but like when she leaves and she looks at him, there's almost this sense of like, not that he's a nothing, but like he is just kind of ordinary.
Right. Right. I feel like in the beginning, she has this idea that sex is going to be the answer, that it's going to be some kind of revelation. And when she marries Paquito and he can't have sex with her, she continues with that. She has this like, you know, she really wants to get laid, and she can't. And then he dies, and she goes on this sexual quest, and you know, she's inaugurated into sex by Mamerto, who is an old man. And then she says that's kind of practice, and then she has I'm not going to go through all of them, but let's just say that there's the artist who represents kind of this kind of most fulfilling love. Yeah. And the way that we're supposed to think about love, because he fulfills her in a kind of romantic and physical way. And then there's Almanza, who fulfills her in a purely physical way. Like multiple times we're told he has the technique, but there's nothing behind it.
Yeah, and I think that also leads to her disappointment eventually with him, is that like it's all technique.
And then we have there's the trio, the menage a trois, and the cross-dressing, and her boredom grows with this.
Like when she leaves them.
Right.
It's almost,
we're told that she's kind of losing interest, that like none of this is really doing it for her.
Well, they kept trying to like up the ante of like, oh, maybe if we do this, like stay. Like they're begging her to stay, and they're trying to like entice her with I guess, like, more intense sexual experiences. And she's just, like, not into it at all by the end.
Right. And then with the taxi driver, who is the only lower class person, not taxi driver, the chauffeur, he's the only person not of her high class that she has had sex with. But she does it with Luna, the dog, watching her.
Yeah.
And it is, we are to assume, relatively satisfactory, but then she chooses the dog over him. She follows the dog off into the park because he has something more to offer her. And that's basically what we know about her story.
Yeah, I want to talk about more episodes of transgression by her, but I think we keep circling around the dog.
Yeah. I mean...
So I feel like the dog is the agent that throws the book from the genre that it feels like it's going to be into something deep, like something weirder and sometimes uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because I don't want to spoil it, but the dog has...
We're spoiling everything.
Yeah, it's
Let's
like
just do it.
there's very intense moment where she comes in and the dog attacks her and the dog sort of like undresses her. And it feels like it is going to be something that you have to look away from. But, you know, he scratches her up. And like I was telling you earlier, it feels like the dog becomes like her god of judgment, almost like identity judgment, sexual judgment. Like she's playing these parts and she's becoming disappointed. And she can only have satisfaction when she's like by herself, but like when the dog is watching her. And sometimes, like, when she's misbehaving outside of herself, the dog attacks her. And she sort of, like, hides in a bathroom, gets herself together, but she doesn't get rid of the dog. She sees the dog as, like, judging her, as, like, correcting her behavior.
I don't know about correcting her behavior. I don't see it like that. I see her, originally, when the dog, who is Archibaldo, the artist's dog, he comes to her and he stays in her room and he destroys everything in her room, all of the trappings of her high society life. He tears up the sofas and he breaks things and he makes a mess. And at first she's horrified by that. And then she's satisfied by that. And Donoso uses that word. She's satisfied by it.
Well, she also doesn't let the maid go and clean it up. Like, she does the thing where she says she could easily have all of this cleaned up. Like, no one would ask any questions of it because she has the power to. But she just doesn't do it. And, like, she actually forbids them from going into the room.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the dog comes to symbolize something that's, like, that is much deeper and that she doesn't want to necessarily let other people into, I think. And she starts to, when she's with other people, when she's having other sexual encounters, she thinks, I miss Luna, I miss the dog, I want to get back to the dog. And what in his eyes, and we're told multiple times that the thing that with the dog, it's not about sex, because there are a few moments where you think, oh, this is going to turn into bestiality. And that was the thing that made me the most uncomfortable with this book. But it doesn't. It's something different. And we're told, like, he goes back to this idea. The thing that Luna represents is something different. And there is no bestiality. I'll just say that. But there are moments where she has orgasms just because Luna is watching her.
What do you suppose the dog represents? Is it just a sort of wildness, that sort of intensity?
The short answer is that I think it represents her subconscious. I think that it's that the dog is her, and that all of these moments where we see she sees the dog looking at her and thus sees herself in the dog's eyes. The dog is named Luna, which means moon. And she also thinks back to her childhood in Nicaragua, where she looked out at the double moons, the moon and the reflection of the moon in the ocean. And so I think that the dog represents this kind of return to her essence and her joining of her physical self or her shedding, let's say, of the masks that she's adopted, be they a Latin American identity or a Spanish identity, and a return to her essence, which doesn't necessarily have a place in the world and the society as it has been created. And that's why she disappears. Her disappearance is an escape from the order imposed by the narrative voice. That's what I think.
I think it was also interesting to me, like when you were talking about Mask and the way that she sort of like carries on this identity. I think, there's those moments where the dog scratches her up or like makes a mess.
Yeah.
And she has all these bruises on her. But for example, when she goes to see the mother-in-law at the end, like where the mother-in-law comes back, where was she at Paris? And then she comes back. And there's a huge reveal at that moment when they're having tea that even I didn't expect, where I was like, oh, this is kind of wild. But I think it was fascinating to me, that moment, and also when the artist comes to see her, the way that she sort of dresses her wounds and like hides it and then goes and immediately adopts that sort of position. Like one of the things that she does with the artist is that she stays on the stairs so that she's above him when she talks to him. And she sort of reestablishes this position between, their positions in society, that he's a nobody. Like, not that he's a nobody, but he's of lower class than she is. And she talks about it, and like she also, like, he asks her something and she doesn't answer, and then like he leaves frustrated.
Right.
But also when the mother comes, she like takes on those clothes and she goes there, and they play this little language or conversation game where they're both kind of like struggling for power in there, and like within the reveals of what the mother-in-law reveals, there's this like she keeps establishing that power, because essentially because her husband leaves her all this money, she is the one that they're all trying to come after and like take something from. And she has to keep restoring this distance between them. But I thought that was fascinating, the way that like before she goes downstairs, she puts on all the clothes and like the attitudes and like the language that she doesn't have when she's with the dog.
Yeah. She's definitely open and vulnerable when she's in her room, which is a mess, with the dog. And then when she goes out, she has to put on the mask and try and function in that kind of, in that society. And the whole figure of the widow is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Because he talks about the merry widow. People are trying to convince Blanca, and on a couple occasions, that she should just live it up and be a merry widow and take advantage of her money and wealth, which also is kind of a destabilizing position for a woman at that time. Like, it was threatening for a woman to have a lot of money and to not need a man, and she could do whatever she wanted. And then there's this other idea, this like trope of the widow, which is like the black widow who's into the dark arts and the tarot, that calls back to her life in Nicaragua with her the other side of her education. So in a way that she kind of plays both of those roles, but also neither of them. Like, she doesn't fall into either of them.
Well, yeah, because I think there's that moment where we talk about where she's very transgressive with the artist. Like, she does this thing where she plays tennis and then she goes to go see him while wearing the tennis outfit. And like, she's kind of advised not to go out in this outfit because it's very scandalous. And she does it anyway. And then he paints her. They do whatever they do. And they go to like, I think it's like a bar where all of his friends are at. And she goes out in public in front of all these people wearing this outfit. And it's very scandalous and everyone's talking about it. And it's this moment of like transgression and like a display of power that we were talking about. Is like, she also does not care what those people think in that moment. Right. It's something that she wanted to do and she just does it.
Yeah.
Right. And then, but then that's fascinating to me, because then when the dog scratches her up, she does the opposite, where she hides all of that and she dresses it up and she kind of covers herself up.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know that I have anything to say about that. But that's an interesting point. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I think there's also, we were talking earlier about what your thoughts about the ending was, and about whether, like, how do you think it ends? Does she disappear? What happens to her?
Well, so I think I've hinted about this throughout this conversation, but if you look at the title of the book, The Mysterious Disappearance of the Marquise of Loria, it's set up as a detective or like a mystery from the beginning. And so I think that we as readers are supposed to be detectives, looking for clues in the book. But because this is José Donoso, the clues are not things in the plot. I think the clues have to do with the narrative and how it's told. And I think that there's this struggle between a male narrator, a kind of male-gazy, order-imposing narrator, and Blanca, who's struggling against that imposition of order and trying to find her own identity. And in the end, I think, obviously it's ambiguous, but we can think that either she escaped that male narrative voice, or we can think that he killed her off because he didn't like where she was going. I tend to think the former. I think that Blanca, who is also Luna, the dog, lives on. And all those stories about the dog attacking lovers in the park, it's Luna. I mean, it's Blanca. It's her spirit coming back to. It's a ghost story.
So it's a ghost
coming
story.
Back to haunt.
But also, like, I want to leave time for people to ask questions, but I want to ask this last one. Is like, I think it's fascinating to me that when at the end, everything turns out well for almost everyone except for the driver. Right.
Yeah.
Like he like the driver is kind of like, they see him as like killing her or like doing something nefarious to her.
Yeah.
And so they use him as like a fall guy. Right. Condemning him wraps it up for everyone involved. Like, her family is well off. Like, the painter marries her sister, who's very much more not as wild as her. And everyone gets what is most beneficial to them.
Yeah.
But the driver doesn't, right? But I think...
But that is part of the reassertion of order, because all of these rich people have a happy ending.
Yeah, it's like a slice of life story.
And the poor guy gets screwed.
Yeah. Like, no one is going to miss him. And then it's like he gets tossed to the dogs, and then order is restored, and everyone goes about their life.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that's it. Like, Blanca disappears, and the narrative ties it up into this neat bow. And Blanca's existence is kind of this blip. And they go on living their lives. The Casilda and Tere go and they live a lesbian life in Paris. And Almanza retires and he has land. Like, everyone gets kind of a happy ending, but it's a happy ending that adheres to like societal norms, an order, and the voice returns to the voice from the beginning. So it's more like, this is what happened to this guy, and it's more archetypal. As opposed to all the ambiguity that we got in, like, progressively through the course of the intermediate chapters.
Yeah, and I think the fascinating thing about that order is that, like, the artist names his daughter after her, but then like, it tells you that eventually he forgets why that's his daughter's name. And it's almost like her memory completely, even though he's married to, like, her sister, like, she's completely forgotten within your minds, and, like, it just returns to the way things were. All right.
So I know we're talking about a book that, by definition, most people here have not read. So, but I hope that you remember this as you're reading it, because, well, so now I think we can take some questions. Yeah. Lay it on us.
I'll start off.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love what you were saying about these strands of the mystery and of the politics are kind of scattered through, like the colorism of Blanco and her sister. And there was a character I wanted to prompt you to
love him.
It's like there's a lineage and they're all identical, and he dies and is replaced by his son. But I thought that was very intriguing.
It's so funny because we literally talked about that when we were at the bar.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Don Mamerto is the old guy who is the family lawyer, basically, and he takes care of all the financial transactions for the family. And Blanca goes to him to talk to him about something, and basically she loses her virginity to him for it's the first penetrative sex that she has, and then he dies. And
literally in his office.
Yeah, and this is something that we haven't mentioned, but her body is often talked about as a weapon that she can use to wound or kill people. And then after he dies, she realizes that he's not unique, that he has all these children and even grandchildren who are also in the service of her now as the representative of the Loria family and fortune. So she finds that reassuring that she can return to them, and there are these kind of carbon copies of this guy who's basically there to fulfill her needs, whatever they may be.
I also think that it was fascinating to me, and I wish that I would have asked this question, that he is there's carbon copies of him, but he is the sort of pivot to her recognition of her power, not just as is her first actual sex experience, but he is the one that tells her that your husband left you all this money and he did this without anybody knowing, and suddenly it switches her position in that family. Like, she's not just a widow, she is the widow with the fortune. Right. And it's the thing with her, she has sex with him and he dies, and they come and recognize it and whatever, but no one questions anything, right? Because they're all subservient to her because they recognize who is in charge in that moment. And I always found that fascinating, of that he tells her all about this, that she's super wealthy and everyone's going to try to come take money from her.
Right.
And she has sex with him. He dies. And then she everyone just moves on with it.
Well, and importantly, the Mamertos who come to take his place are not as more ethical as he is.
Yeah.
So the Mamertos who come to take his place they can be bought. So Casilda, the mother-in-law, is able to manipulate all of these other Mamertos and is able to take away her fortune or her freedom, which are one and the same. So in a sense, through her sexuality, she killed a guy and also took away her own agency in a way.
She fucked her freedom away.
She did. She did that. Cheetah.
So on the question of sex still, I wonder if you could say something about Blanca's name.
Yes.
It was white.
Yep.
And Luna means moon.
Yep.
And then I also wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Donoso's Princeton and Iowa sort of experiences or connections.
Okay, get comfortable. No. So Blanca obviously means white. And as in everything in this book, it sets up a sort of dichotomy or binary, because Blanca is also oftentimes associated with Nicaragua and with so she was educated by nuns on one hand who taught her how to pray, and her Black servants who taught her tarot, and it's never really told, but they were this kind of more esoteric and what's the word? Let's just say esoteric influence on her life. And so she carries within her both of those things. And this is also a thing that I thought about as a translator, because she's referred to multiple times as criolla. So you know that she has, she's a Creole, which is how I translated it, but she has this mixture in terms of race. She's Black and white. And when she's associated with Nicaragua, she's associated with kind of like a dark continent.
Yeah.
And when she's associated with Spain, she's associated with whiteness and Europeanness. But I think that both of those identities are things that she uses as tools and uses as that she explores. Like she explores and rejects both of those identities. You know, when she moves to Spain, she tries to okay, I can't say that she rejects them because both of them also, they both influence her end, obviously. But she, I think, is aware of them throughout. And she never is ashamed of her Latin American roots. We're told that she never buys into this idea that she's lesser than, and she never, like, she's willing to take on this role of Spanish aristocracy, but she's also willing to throw it off when it behooves her. I did not use that word. So, you know, to me, naming her Blanca is another kind of game that Donoso is playing. Like, it's another mask. It's another facet of her identity. But I don't think it defines her. Well, first, yes.
To continue on the names, are all of them signifiers? Because mamerto is also mamor, which has to do with property exchange.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, I think.
I mean,
Yeah.
it fits perfectly with his job.
Yeah.
And so
Archimboldo is a painter. And let's see. Almanza, I don't know.
Yeah.
it sounds like Al-Mansur.
Almanza, I think there is something there, and I think if I went through my notes, I could find it. But there is something about him being from the South. You know, he's tied to the fandangos and this culture. I at one point could have answered that better, and you got me.
It's beautiful. I mean, as I was
Yeah.
listening, it's okay,
And the second part of Chita's question was, remind me.
Yeah, about his time in the U.S. You said, or before it was mentioned that he was in Princeton and then in Iowa. Was he teaching?
Right. Yeah. So this book I think is his first post-boom book. So it comes after the time that he was teaching in Iowa and after the Obscene Bird of Night, which is his great kind of boom masterpiece. When the seeds of the Marquisita came while he was working on the Obscene Bird of Night, but it's more tied to his stay in Spain, as I understand it, because when he was in Spain and he was struggling a lot with the writing of the Obscene Bird of Night, he started reading a Spanish magazine called Esfera, which is like kind of like a women's magazine, a lot of like fashion and a lot of the artists and images that he refers to come from Esfera. And he made these notes and he started coming up with the character of Blanca while he was in Spain. In terms of Iowa, I associate that more with the writing of The Obscene Bird of Night, because that's where he had the ulcers and had to go into the hospital, and he had his attack of paranoia. I don't know if we want to go down that road here. That's a lot. But, and in terms of Princeton, I don't necessarily know so much about Princeton. All I know is that his archives are at Princeton.
Undergrad,
He went to Princeton as undergrad.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you guys might know more about that than I do.
Maybe one more.
So, okay. So I have a question. What sounds most terrifying about this book actually is its critique of class,
Mm-hmm.
which you've talked around but haven't mentioned. So you've got the dark, disruptive
Mhm.
position of class. And so she doesn't get satisfied in the end, or only briefly, because she can't ever fit into this class. Not that she would if she had, but so where, I guess, where does class fit
Mhm.
into the, the narrative tension, I guess?
That's a really good question. When you say that she doesn't achieve fulfillment, I think I would question that. No, but it is very ambiguous and it is very questionable.
But she disappears then.
She disappears. And to me, but that disappearance is present throughout the book from this title on. And to me, her disappearance from the book, this is my interpretation. The book represents this idea of order. And the narrative voice is throughout trying to impose an order that is reflected by the class system. And it's trying to paint this story as a story of Blanca trying to fit in, which some people have said all literature is about the search for belonging. And I think what this book particularly does is question that search for belonging. I think that for Blanca, she does use her position in society, but I think that she refuses to be limited by it. And her disappearance is the narrative's way of saying that she's outside of this. She doesn't belong to this. Her search has taken her someplace different. In my mind, Blanca continues to exist on a different plane, and she has achieved what she's searching for. But that is very open to
Well, I think that's
discussion.
also interesting because, like, what we talked about earlier is that she becomes the ghost that haunts that society, right? Like, she becomes the dog that attacks people all the time. Like, I think if you look at what a ghost is, right? Like, it exists between these two planes. It's not entirely dead. It's not entirely alive, but
Right.
it is
Yeah.
visible, right? It has an
Right.
effect on the stand. So it's like she's there consistently, even though
Yeah.
she's not.
I think so. And one thing that we haven't mentioned is that this book comes with a dedication, and the dedication.
I was just going to bring that up. Yes.
The dedication is to Zelda as always, or to Zelda forever, or something like that, which is the same dedication of The Great Gatsby. And it's in English and Spanish. In the Spanish version, it's in English. So it's obviously invoking from the start The Great Gatsby. And so if you compare Blanca to Daisy, you get a lot of really interesting contrasts.
Mm-hmm.
Because Daisy, who is surrounded by a lot of the same trappings of class, you know, the houses and the clothes and the brands, Daisy never rebels against that. She stays committed to her societal position, and Blanca doesn't. Blanca turns her back on that, and so she disappears. But in my mind, her disappearance is from within that social hierarchy. That's how I think of it.
Thank you, everybody. Books are available for purchase up here. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.